Thank you very much, Margaret and Bob, for having invited me. I'm Veronica Martinez. I'm coming from the European Research Council Executive Agency, which is an agency that is established by the European Commission. And we are funding basically cutting-edge research along Europe. And I'm working as a scientific officer in the ethics sector. So basically, I've been dealing with the ethical appraisal of all the proposals that are funded by the ERC.
Hi, I'm Lucy Pickering from the University of Glasgow, and I'm the ethics lead for the Association of Social Anthropologists.
Hi, I'm Rose Barber. I'm Emerita Professor at the Open University, but I'm here today representing the British Sociological Association because I've been chairing a working group charged with revising our ethical guidelines.
I'm Catherine Littler. I'm a senior policy advisor in the policy department at the Wellcome Trust, so not the Ethics and Society Funding Scheme. I have responsibility there for a programme of ethics and global governance. I'm not so familiar with anthropological issues, so this should be quite interesting.
Michelle Dodson from the Economic and Social Research Council. I'm head of policy and cohorts at ESRC, so I do look after the ESRC's framework for research ethics, data policy, open access, and aside that, I also look after the large infrastructure, data infrastructure, such as the cohort studies. So, interesting dynamic there.
Thank you, everyone, to come all the way to Sussex. Welcome. Some of you have not been able to attend this morning. For that reason, I would like to go through a few themes and issues. And Peter, who's been giving a brilliant talk this morning, is so kind to recap some of the implications of his talk this morning at a special request. First, we've been speaking about the distinction between research ethics and institutional governance. About the historical nature of ethics and the embedded nature of ethics in societies. Often the lack of evidence-based that ethics is actually working, it's good or bad. The irresponsibility of prioritizing ethics over method and epistemology. The importance of realizing that research data are co-produced, making issues of ownership and sharing very intricate. The recognition that generalized ethics in IRBs in the US are no longer tenable, and viewing social science as an information risk. The proposed move from evidence-based ethics to conscience-based ethics. Ethics committees as idioculture and ethics review for community research, and honest ethics and truth. These three concepts were very important as well, so some of the discussions. I've had a sense that the basic nature of some disciplines is more affected by ethical review than others. Lastly, preempting training is a problem, is what was mentioned. Through ethics review, being ethical is more important than complying to REC's guidelines, was some of the views of some people here. And now I would like to ask Peter to give a recap of his talk.
I think you already recapitulated quite extensively. But my particular concern, I'm from the University of Leiden, and we were confronted through our faculty board, and also which was acting on a request from the university board itself to think about data management. And part of the context of that particular request was that the ERC has requested, or is in the process of requesting for data management plans, and this clearly has a background, obviously also in different disciplines. But from the point of view of an ethnographer, and especially somebody who looks at the tradition of anthropological research, there is this complication that if you look at the way we make knowledge, we do that together with the people that we study, right? It's the data, if you want to call it that, the research material is co-produced. And this creates to us a very complicated position, because if the data is co-produced, the argument that follows is that it's also owned by both the researcher and the people studied. The researcher has a responsibility to judge to what extent the research material can be used by others, and in most cases is the only one who was in the position to be the gatekeeper to that kind of research material. The practice so far is that obviously research material gathered by an individual anthropologist is kept behind in a box, right? In my case, but increasingly, obviously, behind a password on a laptop or something like that. But that also implies very important consequences when you look at the possibility of gathering and, of course, sharing data. Part of the request that we received was motivated by the fact that there is increasing concern about scientific fraud, both in society and among the managers of universities and ministries of education. But that claim to have to try and prevent fraud by sharing data is a very problematic one, I would say, because most of the cases of fraud that have been discovered have not been solved in any way by sharing data. Anyway, that's in a nutshell the problem that I'd like to present to you.
Would any of the panel like to react at this proposal that's really been part of the University of Leiden's plan for ethics review?
So are you saying that the Research Ethics Committee, we're saying that as part of your sharing of data, you should do that as a means of preventing scientific fraud? No, that's not what you're saying. So it's interesting that as part of the Nuffield Council did a paper on data last year, a project on data, and as part of that they co-funded some background research into that with EGDA, which is a group that the Trust, ESRC, MRC in the UK, and who have I forgotten? There's 4 funders. CRUK. So it's the Expert Advisory Group on Data Access, and we wanted them to look at the risks and the association between health data and research data and the misuse and the loss of it. And so they did some background research, both of like formal papers and then what they called some soft research, looking whether they could find any other information about loss or misuse of research and health data. They found lots of evidence in relation to NHS health data. They found very little evidence in relation to research data. And I don't think that's because I think that's because they couldn't find it, because there are very little incidences. Yes, scientific fraud is probably an issue, but I don't think it's the kind of issue that people are purporting it to be in relation to data sharing. So that's... But your point in relation to data management plans is that, yes, you are the gatekeepers. So when you write one, is it part of your consent process when you have that agreement with someone that you could say, we're going to have to do a plan on data sharing as part of the, what are your feelings given the difference in the relationship that you said this is co-owned? How do you feel about this? You know, there's a growing expectation amongst researchers, and I think most research funders would have a policy in place saying you have to have a data management sharing plan and you have to share your data. But we would advocate at the Trust that has to be in your consent mechanisms, that you discuss the data sharing at the outset. So you could discuss that. I'm not sure what the fundamental difference about the co-ownership is, because I think you can incorporate that into your consent forms, I think you can also incorporate that technically into a material transfer agreement for any kind of data sharing that you do going forward. So what's the underlying ethical difference between it being co-owned? I'm not sure. How that makes that different when you do a data management and sharing plan. I'd be interested to know and to go into detail about that, because I think there are probably mechanisms and ways that we can look at that. Mm-hmm. And as a research funder, I'd be interested in exploring it.
One of the issues there, and that's part of the statement that we wrote, is that you can't reduce consent to a form, right? Especially not in ethnographic research. So the process of negotiation and renegotiation of consent, which is particularly visible for this individual, very often still an individual anthropologist in the field, right? That constant renegotiation is part of the process from the start, and it doesn't end also when you leave the research situation. In a way, if we accept the principle of co-production of research material, then in a way that relationship never ends, right? It's and there's an interesting sort of shift where you. Once you start talking about, for instance, one of the things we discussed about whether you can keep research material or have to destroy it after a certain period, that doesn't sort of erase the material from the head of the researcher, because those memories will also still go on and they will be used, right? I mean, somebody will write about on the basis of experience. I wonder whether there is a way to provide for that processual character actually of consent, and if so, how and what would the relationship be between the more legally viable procedures of recording consent and the actual social relationship.
It is. I really like the idea of renegotiation, because I'm very suspicious of any idea that these decisions can always be made up front and have an enduring outcome, because I think it's almost impossible to predict how data might be reused in the future as new issues come into prominence. What I think is quite interesting when we talk about data sharing and archiving, we tend to talk quite a lot about protecting the people who've taken part in the research in terms of co-ownership, but the other person that of course it exposes, and we realise this when we talk about the issue of research fraud, is actually the researcher. And so I think that is something that we do need to give quite serious consideration to, and perhaps looking at the mechanisms for releasing data where data has been archived might actually be a useful starting point for thinking about this issue.
Anyone else at the panel? Michelle?
I mean, when it comes to consent being an iterative process, I'm not sure. I get a little bit frustrated with the emphasis on the health side, because we need to think about this from a social science perspective. And from my perspective as owner of the ESRC's ethics framework, the framework is very clear about the fact that the consent is an iterative process. It's not something that necessarily can be put on a piece of paper right at the front of the research and then stand for the whole period. It simply doesn't fit with the way social science works. So I'm not sure I see the issue as much, but perhaps that's because I can't go out and tell every single person that they have to read a document, and people interpret documents in different ways. Certainly the idea of data sharing and the open data agenda is a very ethical area that we're looking at the moment. From an ESRC perspective, we're working in science with Science Europe, with the OECD, with our various very large-scale investments, looking at data, how it can be used for research purposes, especially when it's not necessarily collected for the purpose of the research that it then goes on to feed into. And yes, there are legal activities going on, particularly in the EU, that may well affect the way we do that. Yeah, it's not, for me, it gets really swept up in this whole health agenda, and it really doesn't need to. There are ways and means for us to overcome these issues from a data perspective if we think about it from a social science perspective, and we're very clear that that's what we're doing.
Lucy, would you like to comment?
I guess just as I was coming into my role in the Association of Social Anthropologists, there was a lot of discussion about how we respond to the ESRC requirements around archiving our data, and a lot of our members who responded were quite anxious about it. And I think, and we've had some really productive discussions with you in our UK data service about that. But I think there's something very interesting about this question of consent that you were raising, that it's not just securing the consent of your research participants, but also your field notes are a story over a year, 18 months, 2 years of your own life, and how meaningful is the data when you edit yourself out of the story, and there may be aspects that you don't want to discuss. And I think that it's not to say that we shouldn't archive or that we should, but that I still think this is an area that needs a lot more reflection and discussion.
I just want to comment about this issue about asking a data management plan coming from ERC. At ERC, we receive proposals from all domains of science, from physics of engineering to life sciences to social sciences. We have to do an ethical appraisal of all the proposals, and we do the same process to all of them. But that doesn't mean that we are not sensitive to the differences of the domains, and that we are open to receive different approaches to these kind of issues. For instance, we know that the informed consent normally is understood as the typical informed consent that is used in medical sciences, but we know that in social sciences there is also this oral consent and this issue of reconsent. And of course, when we ask for a data management plan, we are also expecting this kind of information. It's not only a written or a general informed consent or data management plan that is typically used in medical sciences.
As I understand it, the ERC allows participant observation in anthropology, so it's actually quite lenient in some ways.
Yes. I mean, we receive proposals from social sciences, and of course, I mean, this is something that it's. I mean, our. Us as a funding agency, we are not granting ethical approvals, but we have to make sure that the research that is going to be conducted is in compliance with the ethical principles and also with the national and European laws. And we do that with the help of experts in ethics. And in these experts on ethics are also scientists in many fields, also in social sciences. So they also help us a lot in also helping the researchers and the applicants to define their protocols better in terms of ethics.
Thank you very much. I have a question regarding data sharing management and thinking about informed consent in thinking about social media and online sources of information. And I would love to know what conversations you're having within your organizations about how, in what cases do you need informed consent, in what cases is it considered public behavior and knowledge, and are there any kind of standards that are being developed to manage that kind of data?
If I may. Actually, this is creating a huge debate inside ERC, because more and more we are receiving proposals in which the use of social media as Twitter, Facebook is being proposed. And the problem is not when this data is collected in a prospective manner, I mean, using recruiting people through this kind of media, but when they used to plan data that was in a retrospective way, meaning data that was public in Twitter, for instance, or in other kind of social media, and now they are going to use this data that was public at any moment to conduct a research.
So the historical archive research.
Exactly, and in this case, we are facing a problem because we are not. It is not clear who owns this data, because the fact that some data is public doesn't mean that it's freely usable. And this is now creating a lot of debate because we are trying to find ways to tackle it. I don't know if someone has any answer.
Something on the GIST website.
So we have received recently quite a few, well, not quite a few, I know of a few applications that have asked as part of it to use social media. And in a number of cases, we've been concerned about they haven't thought through the underlying ethical issues associated with using this, both in terms of subject matter and the data being out there, and that bringing that to the full attention of participants, especially when you're looking at using social media and triangulating it with other types of data. Disclosiveness becomes a big issue. But there's a whole lot of... So we're currently thinking within the Trust whether we need to do some sort of funding around those particular issues and what they raise ethically when you're doing research looking at new forms of media.
Michelle.
I would say across all of the funders and all of the agencies, this is a very immediate issue that we're all discussing. We're talking about it with the ESRC, with the ERC, with other research councils on data for discovery. We're looking at new forms of data with OECD, looking at pulling together principles for ethics. GISC have information on their website, so do BPS. If you're interested in the ESRC's framework, there is a section on internet media research, and it provides references to all these different kinds of sources that include sources amongst the agencies and the work that's going on with the OECD. So it's worth keeping an eye on that. And also ESRC has, as part of its capital science and innovation strategy bids, is asking for money around looking at real-time data analysis, and that will include looking at the ethical issues around using data that potentially was not collected for the purposes of research. And I think that's the important thing. People get hung up on either administrative data, business data, social media data. Essentially, we're talking about data that was not collected for the original purpose of research, and all of those kinds of data bringing all these ethical issues into play, because it's not the reason why someone originally, put their name on the line. So.
I would very much echo those comments, and I think there's a tendency to assume that these new approaches to collecting data always give rise to new challenges, and I think that many of those really only serve to throw particular sharp focus onto what are perennial issues, but there may be new ways of addressing, preserving anonymity. There are particular issues to do with the speed at which things go wrong, if they go wrong, with using social media. But I mean, one of the things we've been doing for the new BSA guidelines is we've got a subgroup who've been working on producing an annex on visual, online, digital and social media research. But I think there's a danger in isolating those as new types of research, because actually I think often they raise issues that maybe we should have been thinking about more than we have in other forms of research.
Lucy?
I don't know if I should do this, but I would highly recommend the Association of Internet Researchers Ethical Guidelines. So I think they provide really excellent guidelines for doing online research, and they take a very different structure to, say, the BPS ones, which are very this is ethical, this is not ethical. And what the Association of Internet Researchers, I can never get the acronym, what they advocate for is a set of reflexive questions. So their ethical guidelines are very unlike other forms of ethical guidelines. And it's about the fact that this field is so fast moving that if you kind of say do this and don't do that, that's going to be out of date in a week, a month. So what you need to do is you have a set of questions, and actually their ethical guidelines, I think, are a bit of a model for us all, because it's about stopping, reflecting, thinking, and thinking the decision I make is specific to this project at this time with these researchers. So, I mean, I'm not really answering the question, but I think if you're interested in that area, go and have a look at their ethical guidelines as a model.
Michelle wanted to?
So I would just say that we have links to those guidelines. You know, they're all there. So if you're interested in finding all the links to all these different things in one place, then we have got those listed in the toolkit. But I would completely agree with the comment that having looked after the framework for 13 years now, one thing that I'm very clear on is that there really is, yes, you experience new pieces of new direction of research, and every time you experience a new direction of research, it changes direction. People think there's new ethical issues that we have to consider. Actually, they're not. You just have to rebalance and reflect on the things that you're already considering, and there's potentially you need to find new ways of dealing with those issues. But actually, generally, the issues don't change.
To my surprise, I see a lot of flexibility among various organizations, professional and funding organizations. Could you explain to us how does your communication work with the different universities that actually would have to use these discussions in order to put them into practice when looking after our ethical review? Could you give some comment?
Okay. A variety of mechanisms. So, for example, in developing the most recent version of the ethics framework, which is a living document, so it keeps going and going on, we have a working group that is made up essentially of experts within various different fields, various different disciplines, and also service providers such as UKDS and non-academic communities, and they have been the ones who've helped us formulate the latest version of the ethics framework. So I don't sit there and write it on my own. I write it in conjunction with many people. We also consult our various committees and councils, which are essentially made up of the community representatives. Equally, when we're working with OECD and ERC and the other research councils, they have similar mechanisms to get that kind of feedback from their communities. I work with Ron. I work with Ron, who was here, sat here somewhere. He's disappeared.
My question was actually the other way around. How do your decisions actually feed back to the universities who organise the ethics review?
So I wish I could tell if I could go to every single university and talk to them about what we do, because actually it would make my life a lot easier, but very busy. But we are limited, so what we're doing at the moment is developing a toolkit that would be on the website in the same way we have an impact toolkit, and encouraging universities. We send letters to vice chancellors when we are sending out a new version of the framework, and we go and talk at conferences and workshops like this, and we talk to the Association for Research Ethics Committees to try and spread the word about these things in the same way as we try and use our press releases to do that. But you're never going to get to everyone, if that makes sense.
As I understand it, the link between the UK Research Council and the University Framework for Ethics is closely related through the funding mechanism. So it's vital that everyone in the university that goes through the review, not just the people that organise it, have access to these changes, it seems. So it's worthwhile, I think, putting some thought into it.
That's why we've turned it into a toolkit, because previously it was a very big, long document, and you had to kind of find the bits that you wanted. It's now formulated so that there's if you're a researcher or someone from a research team, you would enter through one route. If you're from a HEI, you might enter through a different route. In the same way, if you're a participant and want to know what you should expect from being part of a piece of research, you can go through a different route. So it's just providing a kind of different gateways into the same information.
Thank you. Any more reactions to this topic? No? There were some questions in the idea box, and I would like to ask Anna Giomento to stand up and ask her question. Anna. Oh, sorry.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Anna Chimento from the University of Liverpool. And my question really relates back to the... we've been talking today at the perspective of researchers, of research ethics committees, and I'm wondering where the perspective of the participant community fits in when it comes to potentially their perceptions of research risks or benefits that are valuable to them, or indeed kind of what informed consent looks like, voluntary informed consent, what that needs to involve. So yeah, really my question is around that.
As fortune would have it, I've been doing a lot of reading around. So my area is illicit drugs use, and there's some really interesting, it's a very small but fascinating body of research on what do research participants, particularly problematic or habitual, whatever, long-term drug users experience in taking part in research. And so there is some research on it, and essentially it seems to be we need to be careful of kind of overly paternalistic and protectionist attitudes that say, well, you're an addict, therefore you couldn't possibly give meaningful consent because you're driven by motives of money or whatever. And actually the research that exists says that participants in qualitative research on illicit drug use tend to take part because they want to learn something, they want to give something back, the money is helpful. And I've just read a piece that said that the main risk that they found was that what they contributed, then they didn't see the impact of that. And actually they framed risks in very broad societal collective terms rather than in the highly individualised discourse that we might expect in research ethics committee documentation.
So we've funded some research around it. I'm not sure of all the research we've funded around it, but I know we've funded some research recently on data sharing issues of participants in the process, so stakeholders being the research participants as well as research ethics committee members. We did this in 5 lower middle income country settings. It was done in India, Thailand, Vietnam, Kenya and South Africa. I think it was just published in July, the findings. So that did look into people's attitudes towards data sharing, not necessarily the oversight mechanisms. That came into it, what kind of oversight mechanisms and governance should be around. And we did also, as part of that, as I said, speak to research ethics committees. So there is some evidence base out there, and I know that there's some being done on genomics research and some other kind of research. So there is a growing evidence base on people's attitudes to the consent mechanisms and different types of data sharing.
These kind of public engagements do tend to need to focus on a particular area, otherwise it can be very confusing for the people who are trying to engage. So we're doing public engagement workshops at the moment, looking at use of administrative data to understand what people think about that.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't think this is actually the response she's been expecting. I think the idea is that as a researcher, you go into the field, a country, maybe elsewhere, and you encounter people that have different views about what is ethics and what it is to give consent. And so a question is, well, what about if these people would love to be part of the research, but happen not to want to put signatures on papers, for instance? So what can we do as researchers, and what are your views about this?
It comes back to appreciating that there's different types of consent and how you would collect that consent. And I don't think, from my perspective, we don't see written consent as the only way of collecting consent. So you're talking about verbal consent and consent that's part of a procedure of getting to know someone and them understanding why they're talking to you. So I guess there's different ways of doing it, and we do talk about that in our frameworks, and I think there's other funders that do that as well, and TPS, for example.
Is this the kind of response?
Yeah, I think what I was kind of... Oh, sorry. What I was interested in is more that we've been discussing kind of ethics from a perspective of the researcher, from a very top-down perspective. And that actually, you know, we talk about things being reviewed by a research ethics committee, and there's a lay member on that committee, and to what extent can they represent the views that came up in a talk earlier? You know, how much can one individual... I think there was a quote from a study in India about, you know, I'm a lay person on a research ethics committee, but I can't put myself in the shoes of a poor, you know, Indian female when I'm a male, but I am the lay representative. And so actually, is there, I suppose I'm wondering if there's a process by which, you know, we get scientific review. Could you actually have a community review of your research proposal that allows the community to articulate what their ethical framework is, perhaps, and how they understand the ethical issues, and that becomes part and parcel of then what the researcher carries out? So I think I see it slightly different to this idea of engagement, which I still think is coming from the researcher's perspective, perhaps, but actually turning it around a bit more from the community view.
So we have funded research where integral to that research as part of, before you even get the consent process going, is actually going out to the community and finding out what they think are the issues with actually conducting this research. So I think that feeds directly into your point. And yes, in a lot of our research that needs to take place. I mean, engagement is compulsory in almost all Wellcome Trust funding. How it's done is done in different... But I've been involved in projects in Africa where that is integral to the consent process in order to understand whether the research you're doing is ethically acceptable and what are the issues that the community has with that research. Because I don't think you can take the consent until you know what the individuals think are the ethical issues. That's one step before you even get to the Research Ethics Committee. I think that's a fundamental step.
Does that mean that every researcher going into the field first has to conduct research into what people understand by ethics before the research should start?
I'm not sure they can answer that question, but I think when you're framing your research proposal, part of that should be you thinking what are the ethical issues that could come up. Then I don't think that you can go in there and say what do people on the ground think are the ethical issues. I think you go in there saying these are some of the things that we've highlighted, or if you can actually go back and have a look what kind of research has been done there before and what people have highlighted as the ethics. That's a different issue, and I don't know the answer to whether they should go on the ground and find out what people think are the ethical issues. I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you.
I think probably we can slip into the idea that we somehow have access to some sort of gold standard in terms of ethics committees and procedures just because they've maybe been longer established and more formalised. And certainly from what Catherine's saying, I think we stand to learn an awful lot through looking at how people have addressed these issues in very different contexts, perhaps even thinking on their feet, really, rather than following tried and tested, perhaps constraining procedures. So I guess it's thinking about a mechanism for translating that knowledge back, bearing in mind that you can't always take that and transpose it to a very different cultural context, and I guess that's the real challenge, isn't it?
Thank you.
Go ahead. There is some research into the major overseas programs of the Wellcome Trust and the various community advisory board structures, and they're all very different and very unique depending on the kind of research and the community and how that's defined, whether by the research or within the community itself. But Mike Parker at the Ethox Centre has a big programme. You know of it. Okay, understanding that.
I think there was an urgent question from... Oh. Any other comments or questions in this area? What voice does the community have? Should it have a voice?
I mean, I can just see that in the context of social impact, we should be talking about this in collaboration. Because these are the new styles of research that the research councils are moving to in Britain anyhow. And one can assume that the proportion of research that will be collaborative and will be expected to have impact will grow. Now, I think we need to translate that ethically. We probably haven't started doing that because it will involve a greater intimacy with our research informants and our institutional collaborators. And it will even draw them in even closer to the ethical process. We probably need to be looking forward, ethically speaking.
I think it's a very good point to also talk about our collaborators, institutional collaborators, because much of the research that's been encouraged by our funding agencies is international collaborative research. And this is where many of the problems probably occur in social science research as well, where there are very different views in institutional contexts about what proper ethical review is. But, if there,
Yeah, I'm Ye Yang-Su from the Center for Bionetworking. I just have a general comment, and maybe I hope that the funding agency may address some of it. I have been working in ethics review committee myself before, and now I'm a researcher. I was a genetic researcher before, now I'm in social anthropology. So I've gathered different perspectives along those years. I'm now start to see the whole research process as a process, and ethics. For me, I think ethics review is a very important component to constantly poke us as researchers to think about it in advance, prepare us. And it takes time, it is messy, but I think we are very good at being critical, but seldom we talk about how we mess up, how we screw up in the field. I think that is the reason why we have to have ethics committee at the first place. But I want to kind of reflect on the other component of the function of ethics committee, is to not only provide training and education at the front, but to provide a sustainable support alongside the way. And I think we lack kind of environment to let us speak about how we screw up, how, to talk more about reflexivity, to talk more about the dilemmas, to discuss, the bad ethics, how we made the mistakes, and how we could learn from it as a community. I mean, as a research community. I think I totally agree this workshop is essential, and the title for it is proactive. But I just want to emphasize that actually we don't talk about ethics enough, in a way that to be very reflective upon ourselves as researchers, about the whole process. And I think I just wish it's a start to really, pull us out of ethics as institutionalized ethics, but from the very beginning about what is being ethical and what does it mean as for individuals, because in the field we all know it's very personal, it's relational, it's like in the moment, and often sometimes we wonder, did I make the right decision? But then it passed, and no one we can talk about. So sorry, just a little bit longer, but I hope it's, being proactive again. Thank you.
Would anyone like to comment? Michelle?
I would absolutely agree with you that that's the kind of approach we need to be taking, and certainly it fits with the kind of virtue ethics approach that's was looked at, I think, this morning. I would very much encourage you to look at the new framework for ESRC, because it talks about mutual learning, it talks about shared action, continuous deliberation, ethics being a reflective process that happens throughout the life cycle. And what we had a real challenge on our hands when we did the most recent review, because we wanted to try and capture this learning cycle, because there is so much you can learn from each other in terms of the mistakes that we make. So one of the things we tried to very consciously to do is we're creating a case study directory, and in that directory we wanted to include case studies where things had gone wrong and people admitted their mistakes and talked about how they dealt with them and how they would encourage people not to do the same way again. And so we really, if we're talking about how we can share our understanding, we just have to be honest, and the more case studies we can get out there that maybe fit in someone's area, and therefore you feel like you're more akin to that area, the better, really. So I would encourage people to share I know AREC has a similar setup, and many other people have case studies on their websites, but certainly that's a way of sharing learning.
We're certainly hoping on the BSA website to have some frequently asked questions and also to have some case studies, and I would agree with you that I think the real value is in having case studies that are very specific to a particular discipline and area of research. However, it's proven quite difficult to generate those case studies, and I'd be interested to talk to you, maybe not in this session, but maybe afterwards, about if you've got any tips for how to encourage and generate those case studies, because I think we're all a bit wary of sharing some of those issues, and I suppose it's the same issue about social media, isn't it? And then we go on record as having documented that we've had this problem or we've made this mistake, and then you can't take it back, I suppose.
And some of the cases we have are anonymised as well, so they're not
necessarily identifying the researchers that undertook the research. We've made slight changes to the context in the case studies to make sure that is not, they're not identifiable in some cases. But actually, we've always struggled in the past, and we made a real concerted effort last year. We went out to every single ESRC-funded researcher and said, this is what we're trying to do. It's a real big challenge. And I think we've got 49 in the backlog that we have ready to release. We're releasing, I think it's 8 every quarter, something like that. But we were really shocked at what we did. But I'm very happy to talk to anyone about how we generate those, because it's an ongoing activity.
Thank you. Is this a question on the same topic?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to say something in response to...
Your name, please.
Caris Banks from Bath University. I just wanted to say something in response to Michelle's response, and you used the term mutual exchange, and I think I understand what you mean, but those kind of terms become problematic when you get out into the real world, because with them comes a set of assumptions that the researcher and participants are on equal footing, and it's not always the case. I've conducted my ethnographic research in supported living homes with people with learning disabilities, and you can kind of describe them as institutionalised settings. So the idea of seeking consent in an iterative way and doesn't necessarily work in those contexts. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Only to say that I agree. We were talking in the framework about when you have to go through gatekeepers and what kind of what we call gatekeepers. So essentially going through a carer or going through, if you're talking about third world countries, potentially the husband before you get to the wife. So they're vulnerable people and how you actually cope with ethics. So we do talk about it in different sense. I think you have to think about it contextually, and that's, I think, came out this morning, that it depends on the context you're working in, and you have to think about the most appropriate response. But what we want to try and do, and I think all of us would like to do in this room, is arm people with a variety of tools to make sure that they're able to understand how to apply those tools in the environment they're in. And I think that's the most important thing. That's why I was interested in the topic of training coming up, because that is so important, to train people to understand, have a set of tools that they can use.
I wonder if we've not been slightly barking up the wrong tree here, in that I'll stick my neck out and say that I'm very happy to hear everything that I've heard, and I think basically what you're all about is the processes of iteration, listening. These are dynamic documents, and that's there's more than enough material out there already and coming in. But I think the problem, the thing that I have an issue with it. It's not when we're working in this context that the issue is. It's when a researcher imbibes all of this and goes through a particularly the one I've got experience with, the NHS ethics committee. And it's at that point there's a kind of all of that training, all that good practice, all that stuff about not signing on consent beyond that. It kind of gets forced through this very narrow aperture, in which there is autonomous individual who gives consent, and it's a very atomized world. And I suppose the thing that exercises me is, well, how do we deal with that? You're working very hard to kind of feed, to inform the community so that we might better be able to feed in things that are legible by ethics committees. Another strategy which we've touched on is that of perhaps getting into ethical review committees. But for me, there's a major issue about power here and who controls access to what, which is kind of we're somehow slipping through our fingers. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts, comments.
Yeah, so we have had some discussions with HRA and NRES in relation to specific policy issues, like when we've developed a policy and we've discussed with them about the implementation in relation to how they'll review that when it gets to an ethics committee. But what I'm hearing from you is, obviously, as funders, we need to have a broader conversation about potentially some of the underlying issues that you have with the ethics review process that maybe we haven't picked up on because it hasn't been brought to us. So, I mean, we do engage, we do try to speak, because obviously if we put a policy in place, it's ridiculous. If we put it in place, we don't talk to the Research Ethics Committee and they don't know how to implement it. But, I mean, we're more than happy to take that back and talk to colleagues. So I guess what I'm saying to you, if there are particular issues, and you've listed one, but if there are particular issues where you think there are roadblocks in the Research Ethics Committee process, then as a funder, I would want to know about that. Especially if it goes against if we've got a policy in place and you can't actually abide by our policy because of another organisation, which might just purely be a miscommunication. So I think I speak for colleagues here, I'm sure we would want to know what those issues are, and we're happy as funders to talk to other organisations, because we should be talking to them.
Just to put it in a different way, I'm not sure what is exactly the same point, but our students who've not been anthropologists or sociologists under a regime without ethics review are confronted with various societies, their own university world, and they're planning to go to another world where they do the research. And there's the ethics review world, often invisible to them. It kind of hovers around them, and it comes to them in forms, in the shape of forms. And this ethics, which presumes that all the people they're going to get in contact with in the field will have similar notions of what an individual is, what consent is, what responsibility is, accountability, and they're going to take that baggage into their classroom, into their own world, thinking about other countries, and these different notions of ethics start to fight within themselves. So they actually openly have to choose for one set of ethics, take it in the field, are not sure what kind of other ethics they're going to be confronted with, because they don't know yet often who they're going to interview. So for some disciplines, ethics review actually means an intrusion into the space they're trying to master. So I think in that sense, for students, it can be quite daunting. And I'm sure that at your level, that might not be visible, but at our university levels, where the actual review is taking place, it's a huge problem. And so that's why it would be great if there was more communication about this kind of issues. It would make life, I think, for everyone concerned a lot easier, but that's not something you can do anything about now. But I'd like to have the comment of our two professional specialists, if they want to.
I'm completely unprofessional.
I think some of this is possibly a structural issue, looking at institutions, and that we tend to think of ethics committees as giving approval or withholding approval. And I don't think it's ever really as clear-cut as that. But I think in the research mind it often is, and they're seen as an obstacle to be negotiated. Certainly in my own experience, I'm on the Open University Ethics Committee still, but before I was on an institutional ethics committee, I had some very good experiences with ethics committees, who I think we don't often give credit where it's due, that they can be incredibly helpful and supportive, but ethics committees are, and the people on ethics committees are not, I suppose, rewarded or supported in those activities. And I don't know whether it's possible to find a way where we could engage people who often have a wealth of experience and knowledge and the willingness to work with researchers, whether it's possible to, you know, set up some sort of mentorship scheme or workshop scheme, you know, maybe working alongside funding bodies. And I guess that it would need the injection of some funds in order to do that. But I do think we're kind of missing a trick in that there's a mismatch between all of this expertise and knowledge that's out there, the needs of researchers, and there's, you know, I think there's untapped potential there.
There's one more. Is this on the same topic?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Yes, please. Lady back.
Thank you. I'm Helen Street. I'm at the University of Cambridge, but I'm on an NHS rec and previously worked in NHS R&D, so I've sort of covered quite a lot of ground in the NHS ethics and governance. And I mean, I think it's quite well acknowledged in the NHS ethics approval process that there's a complete lack of expertise in qualitative review, and so you end up with one of two things happening. One, a biomedical model being applied and qualitative researchers coming under attack for not meeting that, or you get the opposite where they're like, oh, it's qualitative, what harm can it do? And, you know, you've now got the expedited process where it's, you know, a week, which everyone's very happy about, but actually what sort of ethical review are you getting in that circumstance? Is there much at all going on? So clearly there is this need to have more qualitative expertise in NHS ethics. And so I was just actually wondering whether, Michelle, whether you in particular and your organisation liaise with the HRA, because actually I see that probably as an area where there needs to be more liaison, and I don't know how much liaison is going on at the moment with the HRA and NRES.
Not me personally, but certainly we have colleagues that work across the medical and biological area that do engage with HSCIC, HRA, all of the big organisations, public health, that you know, that we need to try and get them to. This is a broader issue about interdisciplinarity and people not necessarily from outside the social science, not necessarily understanding, you know, the complexity or understanding us very well. It's a broader issue, essentially. So it's certainly something that we try and address where we can.
I completely see it. It is a broader issue, and it's about a cultural shift and all of those sorts of things. But I just think it, you know, knowing the mechanisms of the specific, you know, that NRES in particular would be the place to be looking, because they are the people that are the gatekeepers for the NHS, and that seems to be one of the key areas that we're having real problems in terms of, as Bob said, trying to filter stuff through that particular process, and that's where some issues are coming up. So I think it would just be a really targeted way of trying to facilitate that.
Certainly, if, you know, I always welcome feedback in terms of giving me more information about opportunities.
My name's Susan Kerrison, I'm from UCL, and someone mentioned a little while ago about the Nuffield Bioethics report on data. Now, one of my readings of that report is that individual consent really will not control the problems of research now. That we're going to have to move to a much more sophisticated governance model, which actually involves various things like greater participation in the research process. We're going to have to think about dynamic consent. And throughout this day, I've been wondering, really one of the questions that needs to be addressed by the research community and others is, what exactly is the role of informed consent as an individual? Are there better ways, or not better really, are there other ways of starting to control the research process that are, which are different from individual informed consent? That's debate that needs to be had, yeah?
Okay, your question is clear. Who do you want to ask this question?
Well, I guess most of them have read the Nuffield report.
Just because we have limited time, so
I'm happy to respond quickly.
Okay.
I got that same interpretation. I think we have an over-reliance on informed consent. By the way, I'm not saying we should remove informed consent, but I think governance mechanisms need to go along with informed consent, especially when we have things like broad consent involved and when we have data sharing for unknown future uses. So yes, there needs to be a lot of governance mechanisms underpinning what's going on in research, and I can assure you as funders we're thinking about that. That's a good section of my portfolio, is thinking about what good governance is and what it entails.
Any other, Lucy? No?
I guess there's the question of something that's vexing me at the moment is what constitutes the informed part of informed consent. And I guess those questions, and we've kind of touched on this quite a bit already, of the individual versus community level consent, particularly in ethnographic research. So I guess when we're thinking about informed consent, there's maybe ways to try and shift it away from that individualised biomedical model to think about informed in really broad, in much broader terms, and again, consent, not to just decouple it from the individual. I have a personal hatred of plain language statements. I've yet to do an interview with someone who's actually read one before the interview, and for me it's much more about kind of engaging in conversation over time, and I think there's a lot to be said for sort of celebrating those ideas about thinking about what we even mean by informed and informed consent.
There's one more idea box question. I would like to ask Petra Boynton to stand up and ask a question.
Hi, I'm Petra Boynton. I used to be at a university. I was at university for a long while working on research on sex and relationships, which is a clue to what I'm going to ask you about in a minute. But I spend most of my time now, I'm an agony aunt as well. So I work a lot within community settings, working with people doing their own research. My question is, and it goes back to the point about sort of squeezing things through small apertures, are all research questions treated in the same way? Because it seems, perhaps from my experience and others here would say the same, that some topics are given greater scrutiny and bureaucracy than others. Sex and relationships is one example, because it's kind of the thing that everyone thinks they know lots about, but actually a lot of people on ethics committees have quite a narrow view of sexual diversity and experience. I'm not judging all of you. You may have a fabulously wide view. Who can tell? But in experience would suggest that it's treated as a very sensitive, very worrying, very concerning, very, you've got to be really careful. I think end-of-life care probably invites similar types of topics. And so often research is given an awful lot more scrutiny and an awful lot more questions and an awful lot more anxiety, which is really coming from the lack of awareness of the committee as opposed to a real research threat, which in turn I think we've heard today about the amount of dialogue that can then introduce. But I think there's also a cross-cultural difference in that in one community there might be considered to be a huge risk, but it would not be considered a risk if you were doing it in another culture. So we might be very worried about asking it in England, but not so worried about asking it in a sub-Saharan African country. So that's a very broad way of asking, I guess, is do you think, or have other people observed that happening? And if so, as a dialogue, how could we do something about it? Because it seems to me, a sex education class for some ethics committees might not go amiss, especially health-related ones. You'd think would know better, but really they don't. So, yeah, I guess any responses of how we could change that for sensitive topics?
I think that very much sums up the engagement or over-engagement perhaps with institutional governance and the kind of fear of potential litigation. And I guess it's hard to think of it in this way because many of us have been used to having a fairly difficult or adversarial relationship with at least with institutional ethics committees. But I guess they're often at sea with these things just as much as the individual researcher is. And so I suppose what I'd say is I think there is enormous scope to provide support and information and training for people who serve on ethics committees too, because they may be on ethics committees because they're experts in one narrow field of practice, but it certainly doesn't render them experts on many of the other issues that they will have to make judgments about on an ethics committee. So I suppose it comes back to this kind of mutual learning, but actually not just paying lip service to the idea of mutual learning, but actually thinking about ways in which we can make that happen, really.
Sure. Coming from a position from the European Commission, there is, when we go to personal data, there are several topics that are considered sensitive. So when we deal with proposals that are using data from sexual attitude, sexual orientation, politics, religion, ethnicity, we take a special scrutiny to these proposals because they are considered sensitive. So, yeah.
Michelle or Catherine?
I don't have any experience in relation to sexual health research ethics committees, but in genetics it happens by definition. And one of the things that I know they did in a really interesting African project was before they got to the research ethics committees, they pulled out all the issues that they could possibly think of. They got some ethicists to get involved with the researchers, and they went through all the issues you can think about, stigmatization, everything that you possibly... So when they turned up at the research ethics committees, they presented them with all the issues they were going to raise and how they had a plan to deal with them and where there were issues. And actually that worked quite well. But they had to have a conversation. So I think it does happen. I don't know the answers around it, but that was one way that actually worked really well, because it showed the Research Ethics Committee that the researchers working together with ethicists had actually thought a lot about the issues before it got in front of them.
Michelle? Say a lot. You could say a few things.
I could. Well...
Well, there's not much more to say. I was just debating whether to say what my view is, but either way it's going to provide some entertainment. So I will not do that. But I would say that, ESRC itself funds a lot of work around sexual behaviours. Sarah's nodding at me because she's seen some of it go through our committees. I think, we have to be careful about thinking about, when we're talking about sexual behaviours, getting that confused between vulnerability and risk as opposed to attitudes and behaviours. So perhaps that's a way of talking to the committees about some of these more sensitive topics and making sure they're not assuming that anything that includes the S word is dangerous and therefore needs to be considered as high risk. I would also agree with the comment around getting confused between governance. I know I wasn't here this morning, so I didn't kind of have the conversation, but certainly anyone who knows me knows I'm very sensitive to this issue around research ethics committees feeling that they have to consider the reputation of the research organisation and others when they're making their decisions, and that's certainly something that we're very clear about not wanting to happen in the ethics framework. So
this means really if the views of the professional organisations, sociology, anthropology, And the views of the funding committees are all quite flexible, very nuanced, sophisticated, subtle. If this doesn't get communicated and properly understood by the committees on the ground, then we still have the same problem. Okay.
That is the ongoing challenge.
Yeah, it goes back to the question of It goes back to the question of training. I sit on 2 ethics committees in my university, and I think I've had pretty much 0 training. My very first ethics application, I wrote a 7-page essay on the nature of ethnography because I was so worried. Because I think it's not just topics, but to come back to where we began, it's about different methods as well. And I think the key is more training for research committees, and also where correspondence is done by forms and you don't actually sit in front of a committee. I think I've just gone through my first NHS ethics committee, and I loved sitting in a room with the people who were reviewing our application, and we got to have a dialogue. And I think finding the time and space to bring that back in and investing in training seems like the best way forward.
Very last question.
Fiona Stevenson from UCL. I just want to respond to what you said, Lucy, just to stick something out there. Because I had a particular issue with the project that I had a problem getting through. And partly it just seemed to me that the first committee we went to just had no idea about ethnography. I mean, really had no idea. And some of the conversations I had with them made that really clear. And I managed to change it to another committee on the basis that I could actually speak to them rather than in person, rather than on the phone. And obviously they still did raise some really important issues, but the fact that they were listening to me and had some idea about a different approach. So I'm just wondering whether we want some kind of approach where committees can say that they have particular expertise or they have someone who knows, and I just think it might make it easier for everybody, because you don't then have a committee who don't have any idea what ethnography is or qualitative research or whatever, and so, and you don't have researchers getting frustrated as well. And that's not about shopping around. That really is about trying to think, well, it's a limited resource what the expertise is. And so these other committees, I'm sure they'd be great for another type of research. But that was a lot of wasted time of mine and the committee's time. So I'm just wondering whether, I agree with the idea about training, but I think, resources is always an issue. But maybe we need some mechanism just to say, I have this level of expertise.
Sorry, just to say, one of the things we put in the ethics framework this time was to say, if you haven't got the expertise on the committee, get someone to help you. You don't have to limit yourself to the expertise that's on that committee.
Thank you very much for that last remark. That's very useful. I'm sure there will be still many questions, comments, criticisms, maybe advice, how to improve things, and please send us your views to the virtual idea box. We'll be very happy to take that forward to our next meeting, I think, in Durham. And we hope to let you know what comes out of this meeting, hopefully something useful.